Welcome to the Product Design Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Coolin, founder of UX Cabin, where we create world-class web and mobile apps. I'm excited to bring you a behind-the-scenes look into the lives of some of the most interesting and talented people in product design. We'll get strategic advice on how they got to where they are today and things they wish they would have known earlier in their career. Alrighty, today we have Eric Lobdell with us. He is a product designer who leads the Facebook design system at Facebook. He lives in the Bay Area and he is a typeface enthusiast. Eric, thank you so much for being on the Product Design Podcast with us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Um,
Absolutely. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your life and your job and what you like to do for fun?
yeah, happy to. I live in Oakland, right, and the Bay Area, and what I like to do for fun is a great question. Over the last year, I've picked up new hobbies like woodworking. So in and out of that, pretty like semi-serious, I'd say. I can make everything from a frame to a custom box, but also I missed coffee pretty early on in the year off, where you couldn't go to a coffee shop for a while. So I bought myself a nice espresso machine and opened a small coffee window out of the side of my house for the neighbors. And that's been fun, but my latte art skills have certainly developed over the year. So that's cool and fun.
Very cool. So, one thing we like to do here on the show is kind of go back and talk about how you got started. What was your origin story into product design, or how did you get started in this field in the first place?
Yeah, the web was brand new and everyone was making websites for their personal interests. Mine at the time was Pokemon. So, of course, my first website was Pokemon, the original 150, not any of the cool new stuff.
Yes. Yes.
And it kind of developed from there until MySpace was the place to be. At which point, I was part of a small little startup that my buddy had created called MySpaceSupport.com. And my job was to make glitter graphics and custom MySpace layouts. And there's a high likelihood that you used one of them if you were on MySpace. It was, the world's second most popular MySpace customization site.
That is insane.
Yeah, and then it kind of continued from there, right? I joined another little startup that was making mobile phone skins for these archaic devices called flip phones. You could scan them in on a flatbed scanner, or you could trace them in Illustrator, and then you could print a vinyl custom pattern that enabled you to, customize that phone to your liking for quite cheap. And that was really cool. It certainly wasn't on the web, it wasn't an app. So that was, I guess it was design, but we weren't calling it design. It was just a means of creating phone covers.
That's great. So that's kind of the beginning. Let's jump a little bit ahead to where you are today, and then we can kind of fill in the gaps from there. But so yeah, you lead the Facebook design system at Facebook. Tell us a little bit about what that's all about.
Yeah, big fast forward, right? Going from phone skins to managing a button that's pressed millions of times a day. It's kind of it's pretty cool. I can't say that it's the most sophisticated design system on the planet, but we do our best. We have a team that develops specific tools that help us distribute our design system. We have a team of visual designers that specialize in creating our color palettes and our iconography. But at the end of the day, there's just like four, maybe five of us now that are really maintaining our library of components, working with engineering, and distributing them across the hundreds and hundreds of designers every day that work at Facebook that are trying to ship product features for the Facebook app.
Wow, that is incredible. Can you give us an idea of like what type of scale this design system is being used for and how many people interact with it?
Yeah, we do a pretty bad job of tracking actual usage, but I would say that if you just open the Facebook app, if you still have it installed and you've ever opened it, it's very easy to spot our design system. I mean, it's prolific across the app. The blue button, I'm the chief button officer and that's my baby. But that's a very simple one. I'd say all of the typography, colors, button, and pictures of people, we call it a profile picture. These are all of our like core mechanics. They're very simple elements that every team uses and has kind of agreed to quit reinventing. And I think that's a great place for most systems to start. But it also becomes quite expansive because every subset of feature within the Facebook app. So Facebook has a marketplace where you can buy and sell things, or a watch center where you can go and watch things. Every one of those is a different team that has different needs and problems. And being a system team at a company like this means that you have to figure out how to support teams where you're not necessarily the expert, and you don't necessarily offer the right mechanics or UI building blocks for them, and you may need to rely on them to help build some of those. And so a lot of the work I end up doing is just helping other teams think more like system designers and contribute back to our system.
So do you get to like pull out a big wet noodle and hit people when they detach component from the core component or symbol?
How funny. I wish. Facebook's an interesting place where everyone has autonomy to make good decisions and kind of drive their vision. And in that way, there's no good consequence of detaching or not using a system. Like failure to use it is, it's at your own discretion. And that's good and it's bad, right? It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
I think there are certainly areas in the app where consistency would improve usability. However, sometimes data might reflect differently in that specific niche, and it's hard for us to really say the system would have been a better approach. No, we don't get to go around telling people don't do that and slapping them on the wrist, but we do certainly take every opportunity we can to partner with those people. And I think the real takeaway here is that like building trust and working closely with people generally results in systems adoption, and that's a much better recipe for success.
Very cool. I can't even imagine that type of scale of managing a product that touches actually billions of people. So yeah, you've come a far way from making phone cases and Myspace glitter starting off to leading, the Facebook design system. Maybe you can help us understand what were some of the steps in between, what were some of your lucky breaks in between and things that you did really well to get you to where you are today.
Definitely. I've thought about this a lot. Like, outside of being a white dude in tech and getting lucky, I think there are actually a few things that I can say worked well. One of them being, I've always been a huge advocate of working very closely with engineering. And that wasn't because early on I realized the only way to make my product real was to have it coded. that is the truth. But it was because it was the only way I realized you could get things to look exactly the way you wanted. It was a huge emphasis on satiating my need for things to be perfect. And when I couldn't find an engineer to do it the way I wanted, I'd just engineer it myself and learn code. And so that closeness and that proximity to engineering, I think that's what placed me so perfectly in the systems world. And so that was one, I think that's one key thing. As far as like being discovered or winding up in the right place at the right time, I think that's more about just getting your work out there. I've always been, I think this is a very typical creator mentality, but I've always been a little bit curious enough to have side projects and work on things that were, I would say, 50% within what I know how to do and 50% something I didn't know anything about. And that little overlap
It's a
is
beautiful
where you
blend.
really, yeah, I mean, you really find new cool experiences that way, but also you create stuff that gets people's attention.
Absolutely. I know we had talked a minute about how you started on Dribble in the early days, and that gained you a bit of traction. I remember when I first posted on Dribble, I was not like one of the early adopters at all, but they were really smart in that like the first post that anyone posts, they just boost
Mhm.
the crap out of it. Just for fun, I posted this really crappy design and I got like 100 likes on it. I was like, oh, maybe I'm good at design. And then I started posting more and it went down, but it kind of got me in that habit of like, okay, I've already posted something, like might as well just continue with it. And
Totally.
that just helped me so much. Just even if it was just like a rebound or a variation off of someone's work, it just became fun to use Dribble and promote yourself. And instead of making a post on social media, it was like I'm making a post as a potential job opportunity. Like someone might see this and snag me for a contract project or offer me a job or,
Yeah.
just meet a new connection. And that blew my mind.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the takeaway, right? I think what works well consistently for most people I know is just if you just share your work and you're doing good work, those are the two like elements you need to be successful. And I think the internet does a really good job of making sure your work is seen somehow. Dribble being a great hotbed for that. Definitely where I got one of my early breaks. I think similar to you, I was definitely not in the like early adopter phase of Dribble. I still needed an invite. I think that's probably a thing. But it was early enough that like mobile apps were the hot new craze. People were moving away from web, and startups really needed people that had experience in mobile design. And just having one piece of mobile design on my Dribble was enough to get me started. It landed me a contract at this startup. It was an incubator that hosted startups for 3 months at a time. And one of the startups there needed a designer that could do everything from web to brand to mobile, you name it. And part of the opportunity was saying yes to something I didn't know that I could do, very confidently. I wasn't confident I could make them a brand and also make them a mobile app, but 3 months, I might as well try. So I hopped in the seat, and I think maybe another good moment in my career was that I joined a really early stage startup, and they needed me to figure out what I was good at, and they needed me to set the direction for their product and have opinions about how it should be used and where it's the most useful. And everything a designer does, from graphic, brand, UI, UX, like all of it in one role, is really a petri dish of figuring out what aspect of design you most love.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said about, you didn't really know if you could figure it out, but hey, you had 3 months and you also had the internet. I feel like hits close to home on a little bit of my origin story where a guy just basically asked me to build him a website. I didn't really know how to do it, but I knew he was going to pay me. So I'm like,
Mhm.
I can figure it out. Like people have figured this out and you don't have to have a PhD. So like I don't know, maybe there's templates, maybe there's tutorials, videos, and I was right. It wasn't pretty, but I was able to do it. One of the common themes I see with talking with folks on the show is like everyone who became successful took on something they didn't know how to do or they didn't feel fully prepared
Mhm.
to execute, but they figured it out. And it wasn't as scary and daunting as they originally thought. And then they could tackle something bigger and better the next time and just
Yeah.
keep doing those slow climbs up, to where they are today.
Yeah. I mean, you'd be surprised. I think when someone hires you as a designer in any respect, I think they're already just trusting that they don't know how to do it well enough. And anyone that can do it with a semblance, of good style or good taste or, good experience is certainly better than where they're at. And that goes a lot further than you think.
Absolutely. Looking at your day to day, what does a typical day for you look like nowadays?
Yeah. Well, I'm working from home, so that's fantastic. I love it. I get to spend more time with my dog, and I am not subject to like the bad coffee at the office anymore. Um, but after waking up and loosely getting ready by 11, which is kind of crazy, I've had like two cappuccinos, ample time to practice my latte art, and I look at the calendar and kind of figure out, what aspect of my day do I get to dedicate to like creating things, or what portions of my day are going to be helping other people and guiding them to success, and what part of my day is just kind of stuck listening to the direction of a team that I need to get involved with. There's a lot of aspects of large company work that it's quite different than that small startup we were talking about.
Right.
But I find myself now in my career doing a lot more learning than I did early on. I think early on I was out actively learning, but I was doing it by way of creating and learning on the fly. And now I'm more aggressively pursuing my own growth as a professional. And it's very different. I think we got definitely off track on how does my day unfold, but
No, that's
there's
good.
nothing too interesting about it, right? 6 p.m. rolls around and I think I'm about done. You can usually tell when you're feeling exhausted from staring at a screen or using your
Right.
mouth the whole day.
Right. So you said something interesting that you feel like you're doing more learning now. Is that because you're more so listening and more engaged with people who are kind of outside of your wheelhouse or your product knowledge per se, and you're learning how different teams use the Facebook design system?
Well, yeah, to unpack that a little bit, I guess it's if a startup is a good place to learn about like the craft that you're into and what part of design you're most passionate about. I think a large company like Google or Facebook, they're kind of incubators for yourself to figure out what kind of environment works best for you. Do you like working on a small team that doesn't need to collaborate across an org of people? Or are you a person that likes to work more horizontally where you can't actually accomplish something with your own team? You have to involve other teams of people. And there's probably no other place on the planet other than a large company where you can very quickly start to identify these skills and traits and aspects of our work a lot more like the car salesman aspect or a lot it's the work I do now is more strategic in framing. I create work that helps other people do their work quicker. And you can't have that at a startup or even a medium-sized company. I've been at, 300-person companies like Mixpanel, where at the time I was really focused on creating great product and maybe collaborating with my close design peers, but I wasn't thinking at all like this. My strategy, my execution across orgs, none of that existed. And so I think large companies really enable you to figure out how you like to work as well.
Very cool. Now, I know one of the gripes of working at a large corporation is they tend to be slow moving, a lot of time to make in decisions and enact change. Is that something that's consistent with your experience, or is Facebook so much on the cutting edge that they figured a way around the organization corporate slog of decision making?
Yeah. While I was at Google, I was still fairly young, and I had definitely had that burden of this company feels like a large, clumsy giant. Like they'll pick something up, and although giants can walk very quickly relative to us, they also are very clumsy, right? And I think something I worked on at Google, it didn't ship until 5 years after I left, and that kind of described my experience. Things were very researched, very slow. And I think there's some beauty to that. I really loved the amount we would actively engage with our users and research deeply. But there's also something to it coming from a small startup where it was ultimately frustrating, And so I didn't think at the time I was ever going to wind up back at a large company like Facebook. But here we are. I kind of played Goldilocks in the Bay Area, and I tried every company I could of every size, figuring out what was for me. And Facebook weirdly wound up being completely different than Google. Like it smelled the same at first because it's a big company, but the way people act, people immediately trust you to make good decisions for better or worse. And everyone here is very empowered to drive their idea forward. And so it's kind of the opposite of Google. I almost wish we researched more, but at the same time, the speed at which we execute, like I changed the color of button overnight last Christmas quietly to make it more accessible, of course. But at Google, that would have, there's a famous blog they posted about how they tested X numbers, like 300 shades of blue or gray, whatever it was at the time. We certainly didn't need to do that. We just needed to make sure the button passed for color contrast.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Don't have to overthink that. That's really
Yeah.
cool. So you've been around, like you've been at some places. Tell me a little bit about the highs and lows of your career journey.
Yeah, that's a great, fun question. Starting with the lows, perhaps. I think there was a moment when I left Google, I was kind of fed up with things being this big company that didn't necessarily embrace design. You have to imagine this was pre-material design. The company wasn't known for really embracing it yet. And it kind of just felt like I was fighting for my craft to matter a lot of days.
Mm,
And I left with that frustration. And I think interviewing around, people could kind of sense it. And that doesn't look good.
right.
But I really thought, okay, I'm passionate about travel. Airbnb is such a cool place. I love their product. I love their site. I love their, their design org seemed to be really the frontier of innovation at the time. And I did this crazy interview where cumulatively over the course of all of my times going in, it was a 32-hour interview. That sucked. I don't know if I can cuss that probably. That just sucked. It was maybe the worst interview experience I've had in my life. And walking away from it, they had offered me a contract to hire. And at that point, it just wasn't enough, right? I said, no, it's like all or none here. I've given you a lot of myself. But I couldn't quite figure out why they didn't want to commit to hiring me. And that's a hard thing to step back and say, like, I think my work is speaking well, but I'm not. Whatever vibe it is I'm giving off is not selling. And
Yeah.
I then subsequently interviewed at, I lost count, but it was over 80 companies. Just sometimes I wasn't even interested. I just wanted to practice the idea of giving a great interview presentation. I tried all these different approaches of maybe I just show them my whole portfolio and let them pick. TLDR, that's a horrible idea. But I tried a lot of things and I figured out what worked for me and what it looked like to be authentic to myself and also work for a company that needs you to be their designer. But that was soul searching as a designer while not having a job was definitely a low point. I don't recommend that experience to anyone. I wrote a blog about it. Interestingly, there were some positive takeaways, but
So I have to
that
ask,
was oh, go
what
ahead.
what is involved in a 32-hour interview?
It's hard for me to talk about this one without like casting shade, right? But at the time, Airbnb was, they were adamant that you interview with everyone, including their kitchen staff. I mean, literally, I met a chef, wonderful person, who needed to have an opinion about me, and that's great. But it was the typical, I did a trial project, and that was fun. And then I came in, I did a portfolio review, and at this time, like everything, this is all normal. This is par for the course. You're at something like 6 hours at this point. And then from there, it was just follow-up conversations, one after another, and sometimes on the phone. Sometimes I just came in to meet the head of design, one time the chef, one time lunch with the team. And
Just really
eventually,
trying to suss you out.
yeah, and it was hard because they kept giving me enough to want to come back. Like, hey, this is going well. We just need more signal on this. Or one person has this concern. We wanted to see if it's valid. And I think ultimately there was some concern over like a culture fit. I remember the head of design asking me, do you have friends at Google? And at the time I was like, well, everyone has a family there. And I don't have a family. And we're like, and in that way, we don't relate too much. But certainly I have people I connect with. That was totally the wrong answer. Like, in retrospect, like, what was I
Right.
thinking? Like, yes, I still have friends from Google that I hang out with. Of course, I have friends, but I couldn't quite, I don't think I had the skills to quickly pick up on, like, what are you looking for with that question? How can I help you understand what you need to know?
Is this guy a basement dweller or does he have
Like,
friends?
yeah, like, do I come across as I'm playing World of Warcraft all the time here? Which I have nothing against. I did that.
Totally. So you probably have more experience interviewing for tech jobs than probably 99% of people. If someone was starting off in their career, or maybe they're earlier in their career and they're trying to make a jump to get to work at a place they really want to work at or get their first job, like what are the few things that they should do as a product designer trying to land an awesome job?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think there's some mentality out there around kind of present what you want to be hired for. And I think that's very valid. If you want to be a product designer, like show your best product design work. And what I know doesn't work is faking it until you make it. You definitely can't tell people you're the director of something and pretend to know what you're talking about. I tried that for a little while. I wanted to be a creative director of product design. Like, what the heck is that? I tried to put on a few kind of facades to see if I could get the role I really wanted, or fulfill some kind of need I was really looking for with myself. So don't do that. What really worked well was finding work. So whether it's a for fun side project that you really care a lot about, or a friend has an idea and they can't really afford to pay you, I think early on, you really should just find things that you're interested in. That was the only way to find work, really. It was being curious and finding things. And then eventually, if you do work that you care about, it's my opinion that you'll likely do a pretty good job. And if you're doing a good job, work starts to find you and people start to refer you. And I think that's the other, clutch thing to do, is just care a lot about your work. I think if you find you're doing design work and you don't care too much about it, you might not want to be doing design work, and you should
Right.
figure out what it is about this that you are liking.
To your point of being interested in what you're actually working on, and like how to interview well to get that job. And like, one thing that has really helped me is understanding, if we take a broad look at like the industry, it's not like a gatekeeper industry, right? People are very helpful, at least in my experience, to kind of show you the ropes, help you out, whatever. A lot of places you don't need a degree or you don't need all this certification, but you can't just start doing it one day and get a job, right? So
Mhm.
there is a barrier to entry of like, you kind of have to do a little bit of this before someone will trust you to do it
Yeah.
professionally. And just like you said, if it's a side project or if it's something that you enjoy, even for me, I just did the 100 days of daily UI course, and it just basically beefed up my visual portfolio. And
hmm
even though they were fake things, it still communicated my design ability. And that went a long way for a lot of different side projects, contracts, and even a few jobs that I've gotten.
Yeah. I think there's this probably exists in many industries where creativity is involved, but there is some level of not being lazy. You could certainly look at this as, why would I do work if it was just, for fun? That's not work. And I think a
Right.
lot of successful designers fortunately find their work to be quite fun. But if that's not you, and that's okay, and this is a job, eventually I think you'll find the fun in it. And side projects don't have to be the only solution. I
Yep.
think there are certainly outlets where, this catch 22 of people need to trust that I've done it before. You might just be talking to the wrong people. I think startups are like, you know, dying for any kind of design, especially if it's an engineering led startup that's being told by investors, you need somebody that cares about design to be involved in this. And suddenly there's a need, and they may not
Yeah.
have very strong opinions about it. And they may not be able to afford some of the talent that's out there. And I think there's opportunities in startups, in my opinion. That's maybe the hotbed, but
Yeah.
because of where I came from.
Very cool. So, someone who's listening to this and they're like, oh man, would really like to follow in Eric's career path or kind of get on that track. I know you had mentioned putting your work out there. Is there anything else you would say to that person to like, hey, be sure you do this, or be sure you
Mm.
don't do this as you start off your career in product design?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is just don't be lazy. I mean, there are so many key moments in your career where you need to do these things that kind of suck, like updating your portfolio. I don't know a single designer that loves doing that. It is part of the cost of maintaining your brand, and like your ability to put your work out there is, if you lose it, the work piles up and you don't want to go back and document it all, and it's in a different format. It was in Photoshop, now we're in Figma. Like, there's all these hurdles that pile up if you don't continue to maintain some semblance of a portfolio. And if you're in this line of work, I mean, that's kind of the cost for entry. Or, similarly, if you're not in design, you need to maintain a resume, which is a much lower bar. But, like, there are key moments where not being lazy pays dividends. And one of them, I think, is updating your portfolio, or even just having one that's not out of date. I guess
Sure.
it's the same thing. But also, opportunities kind of, when they come in bulk and they don't come consistently. But this, if you spent any time contracting in design, I think that's another fantastic avenue, is to put yourself out there as a contract designer and see what kind of work comes in, and just say yes to everything. There are moments in your career where you kind of need to just say yes to everything that comes in,
Yeah.
until you get to a place where you can say no to something, or you can hike up the price and see if that worked. And there's so many avenues there, but I think that's it. Like, just don't be lazy.
Cool. Very cool. So, another thing that you have a knack for is typography, or creating your own fonts. Obviously, that's within the wheelhouse of design, but I don't think it's a typical thing that product
Hmm.
designers do. How did you get into typeface design?
Sure. Man, type and I love type, but I'm horrible at recognizing it, and I'm horrible at remembering names of anything, actors, typefaces. I mean, I'm just terrible at that. But I know a good type when I see one, because it aligns with my visual aesthetic, or it has my taste. But early on in my career, I think it was pretty cool to have a stolen copy of every typeface on the planet, and I had this type library of thousands of cool fonts. And just do yourself a favor and delete it. Like, 4 good typefaces, you can do everything in the world. And I think I had a mentor at one time. He not in any official capacity. It was just this guy that ran a letterpress studio. And he told me one time, he's like, "That's stealing. Like, that's not cool. Like, delete the typefaces and buy one." And so, if you're a student out there and you're hearing this, you are in the only position in the world where you can email a Type Foundry and they will give it to you, or give you a significant discount, because they want you to learn about the importance of owning the license. And I created a small collection in that way. I got these massive discounts from these foundries as a student. And they want you to use their work in your work, and it improves your work, and it makes your work 100 times better. And then there's something cool about knowing who made it and how well it was crafted. I kind of fell in love with type through realizing I was being a buffoon. I think there's something about, if you like the monotony of fussing over small details, you might also do jigsaw puzzles. And type's for you. It's not that simple, but type is certainly the basis of all design, I think, in tech and modern print. There's no
Absolutely.
design without type, in my opinion.
Absolutely. That's awesome. I feel like I have kind of a similar story to your font stealing. When I was in college, I bought a lynda.com subscription, and I was like, "Ooh, I'll just do 1 month and I'll get the best subscription, and I'll just spend all the time downloading all of the
Yeah.
files."
Yeah.
And I literally spent like dozens of hours downloading all of these videos to never watch one of them.
Totally. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the takeaway for me after looking back is like, it would have been better if I just watched
One of them.
1/10 of those videos
Yeah.
and just like gain that knowledge. But I thought I was being so like ingenious and sneaky of
Mhm.
like, I'm going to have all of these that I can study forever. It was like, no, in a
Yep.
year they'll be out of date. You should just learn what you can from them now.
Yeah. It's some reason yeah, pay attention, kids. It never makes sense to steal. I mean, we all learn at our own rate. Another part of the type story that may have been interesting, that I glossed around, was that, and in finding work, I think this connects back. So say you have this curiosity, which for me was type, and I started drawing letters for no good reason. The next logical step for me, and nobody really told me to do this, but it was to reach out to really smart, brilliant people in the space that are already doing this. Like, everyone has their source of inspiration. And so I reached out to these people on Twitter that were designing type either as their full-time job or like consistently as a hobby. And I ask them for guidance. And I think there's nothing more interesting to somebody to say like, hey, you're an expert. I'm very humble and just learning this. Would you mind giving me your critique? And if there's a designer out there that says no to that, like, it's not cool. We're all here to help, more or less, in that respect, because everyone I reached out to was willing to help. There were a couple key players that sat down with me week after week and had me print out my typefaces, and they would just critique them to death. And, ultimately I was not going to get as good as them, but I made those connections who then later referred me to more work, or I found that their area of this type design or design universe in general was way more deep than I'd ever understand, really. You get this cool insight through reaching out to people.
I think that's a fantastic lesson, because just making those connections and reaching out to people. And I have a similar experience where I've reached out to a ton of people, gotten no responses from a handful of people, but overwhelmingly, people who are far more important and far more busy than myself, willing to lend a hand, willing to point me in the right direction and get me moving. Things like Twitter, where you can reach out to anyone, or even like LinkedIn or whatever, where you have access to really talented people that if you put together a thought out thing of like, hey, I'm doing this thing, I really admire you and would love for your feedback or would love for some direction. Like you said, most people who care about their craft, care about bringing up the next generation, are going to be more than happy to at least point you in the right direction or refer you
Totally.
or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of in the golden age where everyone's accessible. And I don't know if that's going to last forever. Maybe
Right?
maybe our spam filters get better, but you can reach out to people and you'd be surprised who will write back.
Right. I remember this one guy who had reached out to me after I released some like little design file on Product Hunt, and
Hmm.
he reached out to me. He's like, "Hey, can I talk about this with you?" I was like, "Sure." Like we just scheduled a meeting, and then he like said like 4 times, "I can't believe that you would take a meeting with me." I'm like, I don't know what type of vibes I'm putting off,
I don't know
but
who you
like
think I am. Yeah.
I'm not that guy. And it was just like it was just kind of like this weird moment of realization of like, no matter who you are, you're probably ahead of some people and behind other people. So like
Hmm.
everyone needs to reach out to someone someday, and everyone
Yeah.
is going to be reached out to at some point probably. So it's like, just keep the good vibes going, help those who request help, and hopefully you'll get a helping hand when you need it too.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a time I needed something engineered and I had no engineering talent on speed dial. I had exhausted my engineering friends' abilities to do fun side efforts, but I really wanted this thing to exist. And so what I did was I asked basically the internet to contribute to my open source repository. I'm like,
Really?
every engineer I know is interested to some degree in using shared code and contributing back
Yep.
to a shared library of code. It's a very like Stack Exchange exists for this reason. And effectively, I got 3 people willing to write the code for free because they thought this is a cool idea and I think it could help me in this way, or I could use it for this. And they contributed to a cool open source thing that had already been designed. And in that way, I found my engineer.
That's crazy. The beauty of the internet and open source technology.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, as long as
amazing.
you're willing to this idea wasn't so precious that I needed it to be patented and locked
Right,
down. I was just, and I don't think any idea should be really, but
right. Very cool. So it sounds like you're really enjoying your role and what you're doing in design. Is there anything else that you would rather be doing for a career that you could even think of? Or are you kind of at the sweet spot of everything for yourself?
I think like everyone, I always want the next step. Like I want that director title or something cool that
Right.
further establishes that I'm good at what I do, but that's not that important. I think why I like where I'm at is that I feel like I'm still learning. I feel like I'm still growing. And if you ever feel like you're not and you're kind of just having fun, you should enjoy that. I've had moments in my career where I was just having fun, but you should also know that you shouldn't do that forever. Like there needs to
Right.
be moments in your career where you're very clearly growing. And so I'm there. I'm learning a lot about working with lots of people. And that definitely wasn't, looking at my Airbnb interview, that definitely wasn't maybe my strong suit. If I could be doing something else though, I think it would be way outside of, like maybe professional table tennis or something that,
Wow.
I go very, like, just the same way I did with type, I go very into my hobbies. I go deep. I was practicing for a while with the coach for the US Olympics table tennis team.
Really?
Paying for lessons, of course. I wasn't like selected to be part of the team or anything crazy.
That's
But
incredible.
yeah, I really try hard at things, and table tennis like just kind of drifted out of my purview more recently. But something like that, something more
That's
active,
cool.
would be fun. Yeah.
That is really cool. So this has been something that I've been wondering about for a long time. I don't know if you have the answer, but going back to design systems. So I think Sketch in like 2013 or 2014 came up with the concept of symbols, right?
Hmm.
How did design orgs in large organizations maintain a design system before the invention of symbols?
Oh man, it's not too different from what a lot of teams are still doing today, which is massive sticker sheets that were effectively these hundreds of megabyte files or sometimes gigabyte files of every permutation of a button, etc. And everyone would have a local copy of that. And in some of my very early design system work, I was using GitHub to push the latest version of that sticker sheet to every designer. And I would tell them over Slack, whatever, chat medium we were using at the time, to, hey, latest build is up. Like everyone needs to update their sticker sheet. And I mean, symbols kind of really save you from all of this, but I think there are still teams doing it. So it's not
That's
the worst
funny.
thing.
I just think back to the times of like building an entire website in one Photoshop document and like toggling on and off the groups to show different
Hmm.
pages and just
Yeah.
like, man, these young designers don't know how good they have it.
Yeah, variants, and yeah, it's a really cool time to be designing, especially in systems. But yeah, it really makes you think.
Well, Eric, really appreciate you coming on and talking and sharing your insight and wisdom. I think you've given us a ton of thoughtful advice and helpful work to get our game to the next level. So, thank you so much for coming on and really appreciate the time.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks so much for hanging out with us today on the Product Design Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure and go follow our guest. Let them know they did a great job and you learned a lot. More to come in the following weeks as we bring on new guests. Please hit that subscribe button so that you will get these podcasts and learn a ton about the product design community. Excited to see you next time. Thanks.